to the No Pride in Police Coalition pre-abolitionist pride teaching from Tkaronto to Palestine and beyond. I am Beverly Bain, your moderator for this evening and a member of the No Pride in Policing Coalition. I want to welcome our ASL interpreters for today, Lavender and Nathaniel from Pro Bono Services. We also want to apologize for our late start. Tech problems. I mean, we're living in a tech world and these things happen. So I'm glad you're with us and continue to stay with us for a wonderful program and a wonderful teaching and a wonderful panelist and collaboration that will be taking place here today. I want to begin now with the land acknowledgement. We are broadcasting from Tkaronto, Toronto. For over 15,000 years, this land has been home to Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live in relation with the land. We recognize the Indigenous land and more than human kin relations created within the knowledge systems of the Anishinaabe peoples, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat and Petun peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Six Nations of the Grand River. Tkaronto is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and is an important Two-Spirit, trans, and queer Indigenous gathering place. While those of us who are not Indigenous have arrived as settlers on Indigenous territories in different ways, we also acknowledge that some of our ancestors and elders were forcibly displaced people brought here involuntarily or by force, particularly those who are here because of the transatlantic slave trade. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people. Since October 7th, we have witnessed the ongoing genocide of Palestine and the Palestinian people by Israel. We have seen the coordinated support by Western nations, notably the US, Canada, Germany, and Britain, in their support for the raising of Palestinian hospitals, homes, and academic and cultural institutions, and the murder of Palestinians to date. Tonight, our panel will share insights and experiences and engage in conversations about genocide in Palestine and Sudan, the impact on queer and trans and peoples in these places, the function of imperialism, corporatization, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and homonationalism in fostering genocide in these regions. We will hear how solidarity is taking place between and among Palestinians, Sudanese, Arabs, Black, Indigenous, racialized peoples, trans, and queers. I would like to start by introducing our panel, and I am really thrilled to have this group of guests here who will be engaging with us and taking us through some of these very critical issues and making these very critical connections today. I first want, and we will go in the order that the panelists are introduced. They will speak in that order. And each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes. And then we will open it up. I will ask a couple of questions. We will engage. And we will also have poetry midway through the speaking list. Halfway through, we will hear from poet Erica Violet Lee, and then we will continue the other half of the program, and then we will continue to engage in conversations, etc. So I'll take you through that so you'll get a sense of how it will work. So first, I'd like to start by introducing Mei, and Mei is a Palestinian lawyer, community advocate, and members of Queers for Palestine. She will be followed by Indigenous scholar and activist and educator, Brianna Pitawanakwat of Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction. Next would be Qui Alexander, Black Latino trans scholar and abolitionist. And of course, poetry by Erica Violet Lee, Neniha, poet, scholar, writer, and community organizer. Gary Kinsman, author, independent scholar. Nisrin Elamin, Sudan Solidarity Collective, and scholar activist. And once we have heard from all our panelists and we hear from our poet, we will have a conversation, as I mentioned, among the panelists and myself, and then we'll open it up to our audience for questions. Okay. So I want to start by introducing and welcoming once again May. May, welcome.
Thank you, Beverly, and thank you to all the panelists and poets and all the folks joining us today. I did not realize I'd be going first, so no pressure. That's okay. Yeah, I'll start with a little bit of a background about myself, and this is something that I do when I usually do this, and not just to go over my own personal history, but also to explain why this is an issue that is very important to me. So you mentioned that I am Palestinian. I am not just queer for Palestine. I am a queer Palestinian. On my mother's side, I am from a town called Sahnin, which is in the north of Palestine. On my father's side, I am from El-Abdallah, which is one of the over 400 villages that were ethnically cleansed during the Nakba of 1948. Both my parents, both sides of my family were forced into Lebanon as refugees because of the Nakba. And then were forced to flee Lebanon as a result of the Lebanese civil war that broke out there. So I say this to say that there's no part of me that isn't defined by being Palestinian. That's important part of my lineage, my experience. I myself was born stateless. I remained stateless until I was in my late teens. I'm also a queer person, and I think in this moment there's a lot of refusal to acknowledge that folks like me exist, that queer Palestinians exist. When I was first invited onto this panel, I was really thinking about, what do I want to speak about? In the last 7 months, as we've witnessed this current phase of the genocide against Palestinians, I've done a number of presentations, panels, and workshops, some of them having to do specifically with pinkwashing. And what I typically do on those is I go over the history of pinkwashing, starting with, or the concept of Orientalism, moving into homonationalism, and then specifically pinkwashing and brand Israel, and how pinkwashing has been used as a tactic and a tool of imperial governments to obscure imperialist violence. I have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go through all of that history. But what I want to speak about today is that we often speak of pinkwashing as this tactic, as this tool, and it absolutely is a tactic and a tool of colonial violence that seeks to justify violence against Palestinians and Palestine more broadly. But I wanted to speak about it today as specifically a form of anti-queer violence that impacts Palestinian queers. Because so often what we're speaking about is how it's used as a justification. But I want to speak about the fact that more than the way that homophobia and transphobia exists in Palestinian society, just like it exists in all societies, pinkwashing and the Zionist project is actually the biggest threat to Palestinian queer life. It is the Zionist project, and it is pinkwashing and other tactics of that project that attempts to sever Palestinian queers from our land, our nation, and our identity, to erase our existence and separate us from Palestinian society more broadly, and to deny the resistance that has always been present amongst Palestinian queers, who have always been present on the front lines as activists. There are queer comrades currently held in the Zionist entities' prisons. There have been martyrs who are queer who have been murdered in this latest phase of the ongoing genocide against Palestinians. There are resistance fighters, political prisoners, and others that are Palestinian queers. It has meant that the pinkwashing pinkwashing has meant that the specific violence committed against Palestinian queers, and in particular queer men, such as the filming of intimate moments amongst queer Palestinian men in order to threaten and harass them, and to recruit them into collaborating with the Zionist entity. It's a form of sexual violence. It's a form of sexual harassment to do that. It's weaponizing familial homophobia against Palestinians in order to further state violence. This specifically anti-queer violence is obscured by pinkwashing. And I think that's important to speak about. In addition to, again, speaking about the way that pinkwashing is used as a tactic and a tool. So often as part of the pinkwashing narrative, we hear that, you know, the Zionist state provides asylum. The concept of providing asylum to someone who is queer and Palestinian on their own land is another form of violence that is obscured by this pinkwashing narrative. Because why should an occupying state limit freedom of movement on a person's own land? That's nothing to be celebrated. And why should any Palestinian queer, or any Palestinian, of course, have to appeal to the Zionist state for a permit to exist or to move, again, freely on their own land? Aside from those examples, the biggest incidents of Palestinian queer death, queer mass death, we have seen has not been, again, because of homophobia and transphobia amongst Palestinian peoples or in Palestinian society, again, as it exists in all societies. It is what we are witnessing happening in Gaza and the West Bank today. That is the single biggest incident of mass death, mass Palestinian queer death, including queer death, that we have witnessed in the last over 75 years of this ongoing project. And you can take a look at Queering the Map to see the testimonials from Palestinian queers in Palestine right now, and the types of things that they have been experiencing and continue to experience, the personal losses that they have experienced. There are accounts on there of how folks have lost their lovers, their partners, their friends, their family members. Mass Palestinian queer death. That's what we're witnessing right now. And that's not, and I'm not saying that to say that a queer life is more important than a non-queer life, but to say that this is the type of anti-queer violence, in addition to the larger genocidal violence that is obscured by these pinkwashing narratives. And so Zionism shrinks the possibilities of Palestinian queer life. It does not expand it. And that's an important point that I wanted to make today. Because what we hear, and what I hear, is the ways in which Zionism supposedly expands the possibilities of queer life. No, it shrinks them, because it shrinks the possibilities of all Palestinian life, of the basic necessities of life, to land, to water, to sustenance, to connection, to community. And I think it makes sense then that in my lifetime, I can tell you that I've never experienced as much overt anti-queer violence as when I attend a Palestine protest as a visibly queer Palestinian person. I've been subjected to sexual harassment, to threats, to mocking, to comments on my gender presentation and my body. I've been subjected to rage. Typically, these are cis straight people, but sometimes not. Sometimes they are queer non-Palestinian people as well. And then we also look at what's happening in our city in terms of who's been arrested, who's been targeted. Many of our queer comrades have been the ones that have been criminalized. Many of our Indigenous and queer comrades, Black folks, racialized folks, Palestinians, and others. What we're really reckoning with for those of us here in this city is how much we've allowed ourselves to be co-opted. And so think about what are the circumstances that have allowed pinkwashing to flourish so much that and I say this in quotes, our events and our communities have been recruited not just into genocidal projects, but genocidal projects that specifically and strategically deploy anti-queer violence. It's in this context that I find Pride Toronto silence very, very telling. You have queer people that, whenever I go, are just subject to so much harassment, criminalization. And I think this is this place right now in the city where we're seeing a lot of that happening is through pro-Palestine activism. So I'm grateful for this panel because I think what we need to constantly have these reaffirmations and reminders to reject that co-optation, to reject cooperation with these organizations or entities that are complicit in these types of violences, and to reaffirm our commitment to abolition and its necessary companion liberation. I think I'm coming to the end of my time, so I want to let other folks speak, but I'm happy to say more when it's the end of the panel as well. So thank you.
Thank you, May. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. And May is also from Queers for Palestine, and I meant to mention that. Didn't want to forget that. Okay, thank you. Okay, next we'll have Brianna Pitawanakwat Olson from the Indigenous Harm Reduction. Is going to make a contribution. Welcome, Bri.
Ani, hello everyone. How is my mic? Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well. Yes.
So Ani minigishgad Brianna Olson-Pitawanakwat Indishnakaz Minwa Nishnaba Windows Win Wasaze Nimdanangus Kwe Indishnakaz Minwa Mimampi Tkaronto Indoda Miskachi Waskahegan Dojaba Wapamkong Sing Unceded First Nation Indoda Bendakwis Nishnabi Kwe Indao Indigiqueer Nishnabi Kwe Indao Adakus Indodem Nimigo Trundam Kinuya. So thank you so much to everyone who is here watching, listening, to all of the other panelists and the organizers. I am Brianna Olson-Pitawanakwat, and I'm also Shining Dancing Star Woman. I'm an Indigiqueer Anishinaabe from Wakwamikong Unceded First Nation, a member of the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe Nation, and currently residing here in Toronto. I also have roots in Miskwachi Waskahegan, so if I make any references to Cree territory, you'll understand why. I just want to start by situating myself in terms of where we are and where I am as an Indigenous person here today. So we are currently living through an ongoing genocide here on Turtle Island. This morning, I was present after a dear friend passed away of drug poisoning inside of a tent, and watched as he lay under a sheet for 7 hours in the heat as the city processed the loss for our community. And the loss to our community is profound. This gentleman was a knowledge keeper. He was an elder. He's from my territory, Anishinaabeg elder. And it is just another, iteration of this genocidal project that we as Indigenous people here are living under. I think this experience and reality has made it, for some, I'm not going to say all, but for some very quite outspoken and quite, powerful people in our communities have spoken up about, the solidarity and the affirmation that we give to our Palestinian comrades as they experience the genocide in Palestine. I'd like to also just situate that I am here as someone who has and had they have left now, but had family that were in Gaza And that's something that is important to me. It is something that situates me in this movement struggle, but also something that I don't necessarily speak in detail about because of the sensitivity of the experience. So I just will start by saying that within our Anishinaabemowin worldview, we see our existence here today as a reflection of the brilliance and abundance of the spirit world, of the ethereal realm or plane that is beyond here. And within that world, we see infinite diversity. And that infinite diversity is present within the world of our non-human relatives, within the natural world, as science often says. And this is a direct reflection of how our spirit world is. So anytime that there is diversity within our human experience, that is a reflection of spirit. So within our Anishinaabeg societies, and this is from the teachings that I have from my elders and teachers, is that we are welcome. That diversity is embraced. Within my own family, we hold ceremonies of transitioning from one gender to the next, name changes that come with that. And that's something that is a truth, that is a foremost truth of our nations. So when I explained my clan system, our Dodem, so our entire governance system is structured around the natural world, of this world around us, of this biodiversity. So it only makes sense that we would uphold that within our governance structure. And that is exactly what has happened. We also carry an important teaching around Debwewin, or truth. Truth is one of our 7 sacred teachings. And as a queer Indigenous person, some of the first formative experiences in my life were lies about queerness. So I remember when I was young, mentor, like an older person who was clearly homophobic, said every time an act of queerness happens, a fabric of the universe tears open. To really press that kind of awful, idea into the mind of a young person is so terrifying. And then I remember the first time that someone told me that Indigenous people shouldn't exist. That in just a very simple passing way, they said, we should get rid of all of the reserves. We should get rid of Indigenous communities because they're bad, and just went on to, and in such an easy way, they were able to literally spell out genocide. And it was so normal for her. It was a white woman who was actually in a teacher position for me. So we see that constant erasure happening today. So as May had touched on, there are no queer Palestinians. If they are, they have been, persecuted, killed, whatever. I mean, oftentimes the argument is that it's happening from Palestinian society, but we know that it is happening from the IOF and Israeli state. But the natural progression of that is there is actually no such thing as Palestinians. And that is something that has been, stated time and time again. There was a human rights lawyer that went on record the other day and said that. We also have in the case of the Sudanese, Congolese, or Tigray genocides right now, literally non-existent in our news cycles. We see the literal erasure of Black bodies in front of our eyes. And that is such a center point of this settler colonial society that we're in. Erasure being not only to kill our physical body, but to erase the very idea of the story of us. And Doug Williams, who is an elder here from this territory, often speaks about the erasure of the Mississauga Anishinaabeg here, as you know, a huge factor in the settling of the land that we now call Tkaronto, the erasure of the neutral, the Petan being the tribe that literally introduced Sema, which is one of our sacred medicines to us as Anishinaabeg people. Part of the settler colonial project was to disappear and genocide our once great and powerful two-spirit societies, our Niche Manitowoc societies. But we see the spirit of that and the energy of that today. A resurgence of two-spirit, trans, indigenqueer individuals leading, putting their bodies on the front lines of resource extraction, 2S MMIWG, drug poisoning epidemic, facing police brutality, repression, and violence every step of the way. Palestinian people and queer Palestinian people exist. It's just as simple as that. And have been fighting on the front lines, resisting, and have been since colonization began. We can look to brilliant people like Sudanese Lillooet First Nation doctor, Suzanne Shush, whose family are on the front lines of a genocide here on Turtle Island. She fiercely stands for Gaza as a medical doctor and brings attention to the often hidden genocide that's happening in Sudan, all while standing firmly against police policy and brutality. And I'll quote Suzanne in saying, "Fuck the police," because she's said it a million times, and it just is as simple as that. So I recall early on that I heard that the movement for a free Palestine is a movement against police. And it made perfect sense. As Indigenous, Palestinian, Jewish, Black, and queer people are being brutalized by Toronto police for standing against a genocide, and they stand up anyway. So I would like to go back to truth, Dibwaywen. From the many years that I had spent living on the street as a drug user, as someone who was faced police violence ongoing for many years of my life, three things I know for sure is police will never admit that they're wrong. They're always looking for a budget increase, and they're always looking to expand at all costs. So it makes perfect sense that they tapped in to the deeply rooted Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism to label in Palestinian people and their supporters as terrorists, demonize resistance to erasure and annihilation. This, whether it's a rifle, a stone, a brick, or in the case of Marsha P, a brick in the case of Marsha P, or even a flag and some red paint. Resistance is in our blood, our history, and it is our truth. It is our Dibwaywen. With that, I'd just like to share just one last story. Is a good friend of mine, Shannon, was a houseless man here in the city of Toronto in the 70s, moved in from his First Nation, leaving a community that was being, eradicated by poverty, systemic, impoverishment, and the brutality that came from the end of the residential school era. He moved here to Toronto and was himself. He was a gay man who lived on the streets of Toronto. And he was sleeping one night with his partner, and their sleeping bags were lit on fire while they were sleeping inside of them. And Shannon lived to tell the story. He's lived his entire life as a queer Nishnabek man here on the streets of Toronto. He's a knowledge keeper, he's a song carrier, he's a language speaker. And these are the people that I see as resistance. These are the people that kept their queerness in the face of all odds, racism, the brutalization that he faced. So with that, I'd just like to say Free Palestine from the river to the sea. I'm so grateful to be here today, and Shuni Gwach.
Thank you so much, Bree. Much appreciation. And I'd like to introduce Qui again and ask Qui, and welcome Qui Alexander.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to fellow panelists and for everybody joining us online. Thank you for the invitation from Known Pride in Policing. And today is a special day for me because it's my birthday.
Oh,
But it feels special to me mostly because for those
thank
of
you
who
for
don't know,
joining us. Thank you for joining us on your birthday.
absolutely,
We appreciate it very much.
nothing I would rather do more.
Thank you.
And it's a special day for me. I'm originally from the States, and today is Juneteenth. And so that, particularly for Black Americans, is, you know, a special day to think about Black liberation. For those who are not familiar with Juneteenth, Juneteenth represents the day in 1865 when the last of enslaved folks in the States, slavery had ended 2 years before, and there were still folks who did not know that they were free. And so it was the last group of folks in Texas who found out that they were free. And so since then has been a day to celebrate Black community and to think about Black struggle. And so it has always been a day of personal and collective reflection for me to be born on a day that represents Black liberation. And so, you know, in the US empire, in true empire fashion, has recently made Juneteenth a national holiday, which nobody asked for that. We asked for reparations. We asked for freedom. We asked for justice. We didn't ask for corporatization and like Juneteenth theme ice cream. We didn't ask for that. And I feel particularly conflicted because now it is a paid holiday for mostly non-Black people. On a day where really we should be redistributing that wealth to Black people all over North America. Particularly, I've seen a couple of Canadian organizations recognize Juneteenth today, which I think is important. I think there's lots of ways in which Canada often ignores our own legacy of slavery, particularly in an attempt to not be like the US. So I've been thinking a lot about those connections, particularly between Black trans communities across Turtle Island on a day like Juneteenth, and thinking about how the police state is really the kind of tie to all these struggles for liberation, whether it be here on Turtle Island, Palestine, Congo, Sudan, and that this kind of like imperialist police state is something that is our common thread. So I've recently been reading a great text by Jules Gill Peterson, A Brief History of Trans Misogyny. And Jules kind of outlines the ways that gender has been policed as a category always, particularly here in North America. And it's made me think a lot about, as an abolitionist, how can I use an abolitionist perspective to think about gender violence, gender policing? And I think oftentimes people kind of reduce that analysis to thinking about the abolition of gender, right? So like, oh, if we just get rid of gender, we won't have these problems. And I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So I particularly think about how we can use abolition to think about gender, to think about the carceral logics, the ways that carcerality is normalized in regards to gender as a social category. Particularly when I think about something like TERF logics, right? So like trans, you know, these people who say they're feminists, but really are trans exclusionary. And so gender as a social category has always been policed, right? And it's a way to maintain white supremacist Western colonial order, right? To maintain the nuclear family in a particular way that is specifically in service of capitalist production, right? And so if we're thinking about gender as a social category, these kind of TERF logics or carceral logics around gender are often created to create systems of gender that are based on punitive ways of being. And we see the way that gender is policed every day, whether that be through the ways that gender deviance of any kind is policed to create a category of people to be othered, be listed as criminals to uphold the prison industrial complex. We also think about the ways that we, these kind of turf feminists, just say that police and prisons are our only option for addressing gender-based violence, even though the majority of people who perpetuate gender-based violence are not incarcerated by our current system, right? And so it doesn't work. And we also kind of think about the ways that trans people are created as scapegoats for this kind of gender panic, right? We see a lot of trans panic happening now, particularly in schools, thinking about what are we teaching young people about gender. You know, as a scholar of education and as of queer and trans studies, I'm often thinking about this a lot, on the ways that people have kind of used children and the innocence of children to create barriers in which young queer and trans people get to self-determine in schools. And so we become the trans scapegoats for the safety of other people, right? And so it's always this kind of deviance is always juxtaposed against this narrative of safety, like who deserves to be safe, even though we know that police and prisons don't keep our communities safe, they add more violence. And ultimately, you know, these logics are ways to think about denying self-determination. So we also see the ways that something like abortion is criminalized in the US. And these same laws that are used, these anti-abortion laws, are literally the same language that are used in these anti-trans bills across the country, right? And people say we have to protect the family, or we have to protect women and girls in sports. And personally, as somebody who's an avid women's sports fan, none of these people care about women's sports. None of these people care about women. They care about control of bodies and capitalist production. So we also see the way that gender is policed in everyday life, whether that's through gender reveal parties, through color-coded shopping aisles, all kind of creating a class of gender deviance, creating fear around that. So for me, when I'm thinking about, particularly on a day like Juneteenth, when I think about celebrating Black communities and what celebrating Black resistance, particularly, I think about the ways that Black trans life serves as a manifestation of a racialized gender experience that is constructed outside of a white cis-het imagination. And as we're seeing kind of these, you know, I really appreciated what, you know, May offered around this, you know, pinkwashing, thinking about how it's being used as a tool to say, you know, just abhorrent comments saying, oh, well, if you were in Gaza, you know, as a queer person, you wouldn't survive there, even though we know that queer Palestinian life is there. And so I really want to think about the ways in which kind of state-sanctioned queer policies are really leaving behind the most marginalized of our queer communities, often being Black, Indigenous, gender variant, and trans people, right? And so what are the ways that we can think about framing our resistance, framing our life in a way that confronts carceral logics in our everyday, as well as thinking about celebrating the fact that in the face of insurmountable death, that we're also seeing that Palestinian folks, Sudanese folks, Congolese folks are actually teaching us about life, right? They're teaching us about survival. They're teaching us about being able to exist in conditions that we don't think are possible, and that often in the West, we have the privilege of never having to experience firsthand, right? And so for me, I'm using this day as a day of gratitude for thinking about the ways that all those communities, all that have had to endure suffering, have taught me how to live and taught me how to appreciate my life and appreciate the ways in which my gender diversity, or, you know, being an embodied trans person, being a Black person, being a Puerto Rican person, being a queer person, has really taught me about solidarity, to teach me about the ways that I may not experience those struggles directly, but I'm willing to put myself on the line to be able to bring attention to those things. And we see that we need these solidarity movements. You know, this time last year, we were not talking about Palestine the way that we're talking about Palestine today. And that is because people have taken to the streets. That is because people have endured police violence when taking to the streets. And so, you know, to wrap up, I guess, you know, again, like I said, I'm really thinking about gratitude, and gratitude for just like kind of the pedagogical imperative that we're learning, especially we're thinking about these encampments. I'm thinking about all the young people at the encampment at UOT that's gone over a month long strong, who've done some amazing education, mutual aid, and creating the conditions for what life could be like when we see a free Palestine. So I continue to send love and thank you to all of them for the ways that they're teaching all of us. Thank you for the ways that all our panelists are teaching all of you all and myself today. And I look forward to more conversations. Thank you.
You're on mute,
Beverly. You're muted, Beverly.
Thank you. Oh, thank you to May and Brianna and Qui for the first part of our program in terms of, you know, the teachings that they have provided us. And there I see a little one. Welcome. You are loved and you are valued. Yes, and I'm so appreciative of the first part of our conversation and the connections that have been made around genocide, around livability, around queerness, and we'll get to that later on. At the end of all of our speakers, we'll have a conversation on all these themes that have been coming forward. But now I would like us to take a break and listen to Erica Violet Lee, poet and scholar, Netanyahu, and from Saskatchewan, and also one of my favorite poets. And I welcome you back and thank you. And please, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bev. I want to make sure that my sound is okay. I'm in a very echoey room. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, Erica, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Okay, awesome. All right, Tansei. My name is Erica, and I'm so joyful to be invited to this virtual gathering today. Thank you to Bev and Gary and No Pride in Policing, and everyone in the Toronto activist space who consistently hold gatherings and invite me to these cool discussions because they're very nourishing to my heart. So today I am coming to you from Sápmi, which is Sameland in northern Norway, and I just wanna I'm gonna say some heavy things, so I want to give you at least a little glimpse of beauty before that. This is northern Norway right now, or Sameland, and you can just see the mountains and the Norwegian Sea is out there. And I'm out here visiting my friend Adita.
Beautiful, gorgeous. Thank you for that. We need a lot of beauty in our life.
For sure. And I appreciate everyone that has spoken so far. about the necessity of beauty and joy. What I'm going to share with you is some of my writing. I had some poems lined up, and I'll get to those as well. But what I've been thinking about, I've kind of been writing in scraps since October, I realized. And being a writer is my full-time job, but it feels like, and I guess being an activist, whatever you want to make of that and that term, and a lot of reckoning with what it means to be an activist and sort of to be born into that position, right? As an Indigenous person, as a Black person, as a Palestinian, as a queer person, and yeah, the complexities of that. So this is some of the things I've written. It feels like my memory of my daily life since October is mostly fog. I've only been able to keep myself alive day by day, hour by hour. I've been trying my best to post, to amplify, to write and speak publicly. But I don't know what else to say that hasn't already been stated by so many others before me and around me. What is there left to say to people who look at Palestinians, Black folks, natives, anyone who isn't white, some people who are, and see only savages unworthy of our lives? Maybe I have no words left for them. Maybe my words have never been for them. I often wonder if I've finally lost my mind from a lifetime of attempting to translate the untranslatable, trying to fit the realities of our lives lived under unending colonial violence, but lives nonetheless, into the text of a language that cannot possibly contain us, and all along that has been wielded as a weapon, held cold and unfeeling to the backs of our heads. I've spent my time as a writer building bomb shelters of syllables, constructing sentences to the patterns of bulletproof vests, writing poems into keys that might fit the locks on handcuffs and prison cell doors. Words are failing me right now, and as a writer, that's hard to admit. Learning of the deaths of Palestinian friends in the genocide on Gaza, though it doesn't matter in the end if I knew any one of them personally, as this moment is teaching us we're so much the same. This, I mean, in the sense that we need and deserve nourishing food, sleep, shelter, rest, clean water, healthcare, dignity, comfort, land, homeland, home, home, home. Each one of the Palestinian lives stolen are worth the same thing to me. That is, they're each worth a galaxy. And I try to feel the pain of every single one as it is my own pain, and the joy too. Whether someone I've never met or someone I had known for decades and loved and knew deeply, I hold them in my body, my hands, and the words I somehow am still managing to write. I text my friend Muhammad, "What we do is genocide studies, isn't it?" Yes, often, he says, but reminds me in true Palestinian fashion that in the study of death, the necessary precondition is always life, and our study of its shape, its scent, its sounds, and its feeling. You cannot have a study of Palestinian death, of native death, without the knowledge of our lives. We cannot wait for those who cannot see us. We cannot wait until everyone is convinced that we deserve life. It's not the job of Black and Palestinian and Native communities, women, Two-Spirit, trans and queer folks to convince you that our lives are worthy of living. In my wildest dreams, I'm in a beautiful place with windows on lots of light. It's a building I feel safe in, and a neighborhood that has a strong history and a sense of community. Maybe I'm within walking distance of a park, a meadow, or a forest where I can take my orange cat, Kitten, on daily walks in his harness. so we can chase butterflies. There's drinkable water nearby too. Instead, today, there's so much snow on my street in the inner city, Saskatoon, that trucks and ambulances and police cars lay stuck and piled up, ghosts in the intersection of Avenue N and 20th Street. I remember when I was here before, a child and a bit of a fool being oppressed to the woman who stood on the corner daily, trying to make enough money to get out of here. Now I realize it was because that corner had the only shaded steps for blocks and blocks. Now I realize I'm about the age she was then. I remember when this neighborhood was my whole world until it wasn't. I think that sometimes in this era of genocides, people feel they have no choice but to turn their bodies into fire, to jump into the river and swallow it whole. And that's life, isn't it? To hand ourselves off to the infinite and hope that someone is waiting there to catch us. But I don't count on it, and I'm not scared. Rather than choose to hate, we choose to live aligned with these simple, infinite principles. Free homelands, free bodies, a free Palestine, and to live in a world where other people believe us. We have said in our plainest words what it is that is killing us. So I do what I do, I keep writing. I write a poem in defense of the prairie grass that stands tall, allows itself to feel everything, allows itself to be moved, but still remains rooted in the soil. I write of slingshots and rocks and kites and fishnet. I write another text to Muhammad that we'll eat olives together in his homeland when it's free again. I think we've done so much with so little for so long. I swear we can do anything now.
Thank you. That was
I just
amazing.
wanna-
That was beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And beautiful and heart-wrenching at the same time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Erica. So much appreciation for that. Our next, I just have to breathe a little bit, if you don't mind. I thought that was really, it really put all of what we are saying here today into some sort of a context for us in terms of the things that we are saying, the things that are hard to say, but yet we're finding the voice and the words to say it. And so I just wanted to kind of sit with that for a second, and to have a sit with that for a second, because that actually really helps us to think about what we're doing here today, which is an opportunity for us to really share, think, and also be able to feel what we're feeling as well. So Erica, I thank you for that contribution very much. Thank you. Next, I'll introduce Gary Kinsman. And Gary, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone who's spoken on the panel, and Erica and everyone. It's been amazing. I'm so glad to actually be in this space. I do want to start by just saying that my emotions are oscillating between wanting to cry, being incredibly in pain, and having incredible forms of anger all simultaneously. So hopefully they'll both inform what I'm saying and help me through it. The title of what I want to talk about is called No Pride in Genocide. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the history and the development and transformation of slogans that people use. So that in 2021 in Canada, No Pride in Genocide was in particular being applied and related to the genocidal campaigns against Indigenous people, and especially the residential school death camps. in 2023, 2024, we're seeing how this notion of no pride in genocide is actually being expanded in numerous contexts, but including in particular around the Palestinian people and the Palestinian struggle, and has actually come to resonate perhaps a little bit more clearly with the history of what pride is supposed to be like within our communities. So one of the things I often talk about is how ruling takes place in the types of societies which we live in. Ruling often takes place through what I describe as the social organization of forgetting, where we came from and how we got to be in the situations that we currently are in. It also raises the question of who wants us to forget, and why do they want us to forget, and why is it now that mainstream LGBT plus and AIDS groups and many pride groups are actually trying to get us to forget where we actually came from and our history of resistance. So the antidote to the social organization of forgetting is the resistance of remembering. And I just wanted to start off with some glimpses into what the resistance of remembering might look like as a way of getting out of this state of the social organization of forgetting. When I first came out in 1972, which is a while ago, the most regular, consistent activity being organized by gay and lesbian feminist organizations were actually anti-Vietnam War contingents. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about 1972. We're talking about the early emergence of the queer liberation movement. And it was both anti-Vietnam War contingents, but also Vietnam solidarity contingents. Remember also that the Gay Liberation Front, when it was formed in New York City in 1969, was specifically named after the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, which was then at war with US imperialism and militarism. Later on, we actually can see how pride movements, even though there were already problems emerging here, were also very identified with the anti-apartheid organizing in South Africa. That in Toronto, for instance, a number of us were involved in the Simon and Cody Anti-Apartheid Committee, which was, Simon and Cody was a Black anti-apartheid activist who was also gay, and we organized in his defense, and we organized both against apartheid and against racism and settler colonialism, but we also organized in defense of queer liberation at that point in time. We can jump ahead to what happens in Toronto with Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. Remember when that emerges, and sort of the high point of its emergence is 2010, that there were incredible attacks upon it to try to censor it, to try to ban it, to try by various different organizations, state organizations, Zionist organizations, all sorts of organizations who tried to actually destroy Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. But Queers Against Israeli Apartheid survived and did a lot of work and education in support of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign in support of Palestine. Of course, we can also then see Black Lives Matter Toronto and the disruption of the Pride Parade in 2016, which was what was necessary to actually get corporate Pride Toronto, to actually recognize the significance of anti-Black racism on some levels and the recognition of police violence. So why are some people suggesting then, given that history of where Pride comes from in terms of fighting against oppression, fighting against racism, fighting against colonialism, fighting against imperialism, why are there some people suggesting that we should actually be celebrating Pride because we actually want to celebrate genocide, right? Or we want to be neutral, we want to just not notice what's going on in the world around us, which is what basically most of the mainstream LGBT groups in Canada, in so-called Canada, are saying. And groups like Pride Toronto are basically saying, yes, we'll call for a ceasefire, but don't try to push us any further than that. It does remind me of a talk I recently heard by Jasper Puar, which was given at U of T, which was called Gays for Genocide. And I think we unfortunately have to recognize that there are increasing numbers of gay people and queer people more generally who are actually organizing for genocide. In particular, she talked about those Israeli offense forces, or Israeli defense forces, as they would call them, troops who've gone onto the areas in Gaza which have been totally destroyed, and they hold up pride flags, as if this is somehow what queer pride is supposed to be about. So I'm getting a little bit angry here, as you can possibly notice. So they're talking about celebrating pride by ignoring the genocide that is going on, which is really to say we're celebrating genocide. We don't care if Palestinians are suffering pain and carnage, and thousands of them are being killed all the time, including lots of, as Mason pointed out, lots and lots of queer, trans, and gender diverse Palestinians. Why is it that Pride Toronto refused to even discuss the call from queers in Palestine that everyone in the world should actually be listening to, that's supported by 550 queer and trans organizations around the world? But they refuse to even allow the members to discuss that. So what I describe here is actually, this is not about gay pride. It's actually about what I would call gay or queer shame. That's really what they're wanting us to celebrate on these official pride events this year. They want us to actually support the genocidal practices of the Canadian state. By the way, one of the contingents that will be in Pride Toronto's corporate march is the Federal Liberal Party. I just hope Genocide Justin is also not there, but also the banks are there. The Toronto Dominion Bank, the main sponsor of corporate pride in Toronto, has $16 million invested in General Dynamics, which makes arms for the genocide that's currently going on in Israel against, in Gaza against the Palestinian people. They also, of course, support Coastal GasLink in its battles against the Wet'suwet'en Nation and against land and water defenders more generally. Other banks like Scotiabank support Elbit Systems, the biggest arms system that is involved in the genocide that's going on against people in Gaza right now. We refuse and we reject, and we must refuse and reject this notion that somehow pride in genocide is in any way justified or even thinkable. But there is resistance going on, and this is sort of where I want to more end. There's an awful lot that could be said more than this, but there's resistance going on. We have to recognize that one of the groups that's actually emerged in numerous different locations across the so-called Canadian state are groups like Queers for Palestine, and they take different characteristics in different places. That many of the people involved in the student-based uprisings against what's going on in Gaza and against the Canadian state and the Canadian banks, that all of those people who support genocide, many of those people are queer and trans. We have to remember, and I think celebrate, that in Winnipeg, Queers for Palestine, people involved in anti-police organizing and abolitionist organizing stopped the mainstream Pride Parade for 45 minutes because they did not want it to be a celebration of genocide. And they did not want it to be a celebration of the banks that are involved in killing people in Gaza right now. And there's an awful lot more that we could actually talk about in terms of resistance. But the one example that obviously this teach-in is about is Abolitionist Pride. And there's various forms that takes in various different places, but a number of us here are located in Tkaronto, and I really want to urge people to come out to Abolitionist Pride, which is also anti-genocidal and anti-fascist pride in Toronto. And we'll be making the types of connections that you're hearing about at this teach-in. So that, just to point it out to people, is the only place I think people should be celebrating Pride this year is in an anti-genocidal context. And that means coming to Grange Park at 2 p.m. on June 30th. For me, it's the only possible place to celebrate Pride in a liberationist and transformative context. We cannot celebrate Pride without addressing directly the genocide that's going on. If we're talking about queer and trans liberation, we cannot celebrate Pride in terms of genocide. We must be completely opposed to genocide. And the last thing I just want to point out is that the Palestinian solidarity movement, and this is not new. I mean, there's been vicious forms of policing against Indigenous people, Black people, unhoused people all sorts of groups of people for a long period of time. It's not new, but if we actually look at the amount of police violence against Palestine solidarity activists, again, many of whom are queer and trans, we have to recognize, why is it that Pride Toronto and these mainstream LGBT groups have said absolutely nothing against this type of violence that's going on? Why do they actually, by and large right now, allow police budgets to be expanded and actually cooperate with the police on their corporate pride demonstrations? So much that last year they actually led to having such police presence that the Indigenous drumming group had to leave the trans march, that many people who raised concerns about the police were actually told by the head Pride Toronto Marshal that you actually should leave this event. You shouldn't be in it. You're not related to what's going on with the trans march. So I think it's really important that we can no longer be silent, that we have to act up, as the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in the Context of the AIDS Crisis put it, and that we actually need to say things like no pride in genocide. We need to refuse and reject all of those people who think pride is somehow based on genocide. We need to argue for abolitionist pride, and we need to argue and celebrate in the streets as much as we can revolutionary hope and love, which is based on opposition to genocide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thanks for reminding people that NPPC is hosting Abolitionist Pride, and this year from Tkaronto to Palestine and beyond, and that's where people should be. So thank you for that. And our final speaker is Nisrin Elamin. And Nisrin, welcome again, and thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. Please, Beverly, stop me if I go over time, because it's always hard for me to talk about Sudan. So I just want to start by thanking you and the No Pride in Policing Coalition for inviting me and for including Sudan in this conversation, because I think often the struggle for a liberated Sudan is seen as disconnected from other anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist struggles for border, police, and state abolition, for Indigenous sovereignty, from Palestine to Turtle Island, for queer liberation, for climate justice, and so forth. Rather than speaking specifically to these struggles within the Sudanese context, I'm going to kind of apply this framework of analysis to what's happening in Sudan. So, as you know, the war in Sudan has received very little attention in mainstream media, which of course has to do with anti-Black racism and the assumption that African countries like Sudan are perpetually at war with themselves, that it's somehow a natural way of being for us. And this is, of course, purposeful. If you notice, the little attention Sudan does get focuses primarily on the humanitarian catastrophe and famine that the war has produced in a very decontextualized and dehistoricized way. And this framing points us towards particular kinds of solutions and external forms of intervention that undermine Sudanese people's sovereignty, visions, and processes to help themselves and to continue challenging the nature of the Sudanese state that began during the 2018 revolution. So the first point I want to make is that there are no wars in 2024 that we living here in the settler colonies of North America are not somehow connected to, whether it is through our tax dollars, our pension funds, our university endowments, the banks we deposit our money in, the cell phones we use, and so on, especially in relation to the Congo. I remember taking a picture at the very beginning of this war of missile caps that were strewn all over the ground as my family and I were walking through Khartoum from one bus station to another. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of these caps all around us, alongside hollowed out cars, burnt out buildings, grenades, and bullets that have by now killed an estimated 200,000 Sudanese. And my 3-year-old at the time asked me what they were. So when I got back to Toronto, I looked them up, and I found that a strike-to-air missile from Russia cost $1.5 million. A cruise missile funded by the Emirates cost $2.1 million. It costs 500 for rocket-propelled grenades and drones provided by Ukraine. And each of these weapons is sourced from different parts of the globe, including Canada. So I just want to say that. And then I usually provide a lot of historical context when I'm asked to talk about Sudan and the genocidal violence that is in Darfur at the moment. But today I'm going to refer you to some of these resources, some resources instead that I'll put in the chat. I'll just say here that the war that has been raging in Sudan since last April between two factions of a military regime that grabbed power in October of 2021 is a counter-revolutionary war that is attempting to dismantle a powerful popular revolution which overthrew the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power in 2019. The backbone of the revolution consists of neighborhood resistance committees, of which there are 8,000 across the country, but also independent farmer and labor unions, youth and student formations, queer and feminist organizers, the kind of grassroots civil society that has mostly resisted NGOization and formal opposition party politics. And the resistance committees in particular have created a revolutionary charter for what the path forward looks like, for what dismantling the Sudanese state looks like, for what reclaiming and redistributing state power looks like, potentially in the absence of the nation state, which is inherently violent, ethno-nationalist, heteropatriarchal, and extractive. And the roots of this war can be traced back several decades to the beginning of Sudan's civil war, first civil war in 1955, during which elites in Sudan center violently repressed South Sudanese dissent and demands for political representation, and exploited land, labor, and natural resources to fuel this violent campaign of repression that later extended to areas like Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, where the state and its militias have targeted, murdered, and displaced non-Arab indigenous communities in particular from lands that are now being used for mining. Sudanese elites, who have always been ethno-nationalist, inherited a violent, extractive, colonial, heteropatriarchal police state from our British colonizers that enabled them to expand the security apparatus of the state, creating special police forces, torture houses, militias, etc., to continue extracting resources in order to consolidate their power, such that the latest 2021 national budget, and this was during the revolution, reflected a 70% expenditure on the security state at the expense of education, healthcare, etc., which is, of course, similar to our North American states. When this war began in April of 2023, the military coup regime imploded and split, with each military faction vying not only for political but also economic control of the country. On one side, we have the Rapid Support Forces, who were responsible for the genocide in Darfur, which began in 2003, led by General Hemedti, whose leaders control much of the illicit gold trade in the country, which gets funneled through the gold markets of the Emirates and sold to Russia and other countries. Sudan is the world's 12th largest producer of gold, and the UAE, as its main trading partner, is now providing critical military support to the RSF as it extracts our gold. And on the other hand, we have the army and its allied Islamists, led by General Burhan, who control large sectors of the Sudanese economy, close to 200 companies in rubber, livestock, wheat, real estate, construction, etc., which are in turn backed by Gulf financing and have close ties to Egypt's Sisi. Ukraine and Iran recently started supporting the army, presumably in an attempt to challenge the power and wealth the UAE and Russia are accumulating through this war. The RSF was legitimized by the European Union in 2014, which is attempting to externalize its border to the region between Sudan and Libya. And at the time, they funded the RSF to the tune of 200 million to militarize that border in order to stem the migration of East Africans into Europe. The RSF and army have both sent troops to fight in Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf. The Saudis and Emiratis have invested a combined 27 billion in Sudanese land, real estate, and infrastructure over the last 2 decades, and now control more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's domestic investors combined, dispossessing farmers and decimating the small-scale agricultural sector, and co-creating with Sudanese business and military elites the condition for food insecurity that have now resulted in a full-blown famine that a Norwegian institute estimates could kill 2.5 million Sudanese over the next few months. There are also PR, weapons manufacturing, and mining companies in Canada that are implicated, such as the Montreal-based Dickens and Madsen firm led by the ex-Israeli intelligence officer Ari Ben Menashe, which represented the RSF after it committed a massacre against revolutionaries. And so all of this compels me to frame this war not as an internal power struggle or even a proxy war, but as an internationalized, multi-scalar, counter-revolutionary war that is meant to protect the interests of Sudanese state and business elites and their international partners. And I'm almost done, sorry. The Sudanese civilian population of 45 million is now caught in the middle of the senseless war, while its 7 borders remain difficult to reach and cross. Sudanese people are dying in the Egyptian desert after spending their life savings to get smuggled across the border because the Egyptians are no longer processing visas. The EU recently funded the Egyptian government to begin deporting Sudanese refugees. The war has produced the biggest internal displacement crisis in the world, over 10 million people, and yet no country has issued free expedited visas for Sudanese refugees, including Canada. Canada created a very prohibitive, expensive for Sudanese families, reunification program, family reunification program that is heteronormative and queerphobic, and that was capped at 3,250, which is just a bit better than the cap they established for Gaza, and they've started rejecting people because the cap has been exceeded. 25 million people are now in dire need of food assistance in a country that could easily feed itself in the region and where farmers are being prevented from planting. In the midst of all this, the revolution continues in some form. Emergency response rooms have emerged across the country during the war, modeled after resistance committees and led by many of its members. In the face of a largely absent international aid community and state, they are leading food and medicine distribution efforts, organizing communal kitchens, driving ambulances, coordinating evacuations, setting up ad hoc emergency clinics and rape crisis centers, converting defunct schools into shelters, retrieving and burying dead bodies, organizing activities and learning for the 19 million children that are out of school. And many are led by young organizers, queer, feminists, etc., who are being targeted, raped, harassed, and imprisoned by both warring factions. If you'd like to support them, you can go to sudansolidarity.com. And then finally, the revolution in Sudan has shown us that self-determination can and does exist in the absence of the state in its current formation. That a world without extractive, ethno-nationalist, heteropatriarchal police states and borders and deadly border regimes is not only an abstract theory, but a necessity if we are all to survive and thrive. The resistance committees and emergency response rooms, driven by a radical politics of mutual aid, are creating moments of safety and building community in the midst of unimaginable violence. It is their sheer insistence on existing, on life as a form of resistance, that has kept many of our loved ones, including most of my family, from losing amal, or hope, as a discipline, as Mariam Kaba puts it. We should divest from this idea that the Canadian or US state will ever do right by Sudanese people, but we can hold them accountable for the harm and damage they are causing all over the world, including in Sudan, and demand that they keep their hands off Sudan, but also Palestine and Haiti and so on. We should divest from the idea that humanitarian aid organizations are going to save us, even if we need corridors for aid to open, and instead recognize the ways the colonial systems in which they operate are undermining people's ability to take care of each other. Instead, we should invest in a transnational solidarity politics that puts trust in the revolutionaries fulfilling the role of the state in its absence and support their anti-colonial, anti-capitalist vision for a free Sudan and world that centers queer and Indigenous and Black liberation and climate justice. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Nisrin. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters. I'd like to invite you all to come to turn your cameras on so we can, we can all chat. And this, I think what we have heard so far speaks clearly, to the way in which, genocide, colonialism, imperialism, Zionist nationalism, white supremacy, corporatization, continues, to destroy, Palestinians, Sudanese, Black, Indigenous, racialized people's lives in so many different ways, and queers and trans, right? We have seen that many queers and trans, as we heard, have made deliberate choices to abandon other queers and trans, particularly those of us who dare to speak up against genocide, who dare to speak up against violence, who dare to speak up against the ongoing recolonization, of people's lives, of Indigenous people's lives, of Palestinian people's lives, of all of our lives, those of us affected by colonization and settler colonialism. Yet, what is clear from listening to all of you is that we, and from the poetry that Erica has given, from the work that May has taken us through in terms of taking us through a conversation on pinkwashing that is used as a weapon, as a way to destroy Palestinian queer lives and Palestinian trans lives. And we can and we see that from these conversations that we're having here is that we are still finding the words, even though it's hard. We're still finding the words and the way to say this and to make this heard, right? And clearly, we know what is required. And there are many of us who do. We're on the street. But yes, there is a repressive, we're living in a repressive time. We're living in an ethno-racial, recolonizing time in terms of what we can and cannot say and how we can say it, and what we're allowed to say and what we're allowed to do. And if we look at what's happening around the encampments, around the country and at U of T, in terms of the suppression and repression, of Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, Black, Indigenous voices and their right to call out a genocide and to hold its institution, accountable for its implication and participation and ongoing support of a genocide. And we see what's happening. And many of those in campus, may I add, are also queer and trans, who are Palestinians. Some are Palestinians and some are queer, some are Arabs, some are Black. I mean, they're all there at the encampment, in that capacity as well. So they're also recognizing what it is to be queer and trans in those spaces and what it's to be queer and trans in this moment. So I want to open up the floor for people to talk about what, how do we build? How do we together? Because as people, I mean, what we are witnessing is that we have this, there's so much we have in common, because here we are fighting liberation struggles. We're fighting a liberation struggle in Sudan, in Congo. We're fighting liberation struggles in IT, right? We're fighting liberation struggles in Palestine and have been for decades. We are here, queers and trans are fighting a liberation struggle too, against queers and trans who are homonationalist and who participate in this in the ongoing structure that exists. So how do we together build on the kinds of struggle that we have, but on an internationalist level? Because I'm wondering, is this time for us to create an internationalist liberation movement? Because it seems that we are in that moment where that is something we need to think about as queer and trans and people in the struggle for a free Palestine, a free Sudan, a free Congo, a free Haiti, a free world in general. Is this a moment for us to consider and building an international liberation struggle that encompasses those of us who want freedom and see the possibility of freedom and know that there is a possibility of freedom and that we will live, and how to make that happen? So I'm just going to throw that out and let you take that up. And you can go in any order you choose, please. And Erica, you're welcome to join the conversation. Please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. Yes, I think now is the time. I think something I've been reflecting on is the ways in which particularly Western governments use queer and trans people as this kind of like liberal, kind of like, we are like, in Palestine, they don't like queers, and in Africa, they don't like queers, and all these things to kind of say like, the West is actually the place that treats queer and trans people well, as if queer and trans people are not dying here in North America every day at the hands of the police, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really, really important for us to highlight that, right? To think about like, let us not be used as a scapegoat as queer and trans people to kind of like basically create this othering of non-Western countries. So I think about that a lot, particularly as an American, right? It's like the US empire is really, really good at that. And thinking about how the Canadian empire likes to be complicit in that as well. So I think about that. I think about the Black radical tradition being an internationalist tradition, right? And saying empire is actually the thing that we have to think about, and the ways that it permeates all over the world, and that these struggles are connected because of empire. So when empire and capitalism falls, we'll be able to have different conversations about this, right? And I think we're pushing towards that more than we ever have. And I'm really inspired by young people today, because they are crystal clear that they are inheriting a world where the people who've been in power historically left them nothing, left them barely having a planet, right? And so their radical, like, just unapologetic nature of saying, well, if you didn't leave us shit, we're going to take what we need to live in this world, right? And so I just feel like I wasn't organizing like that when I was in undergrad. You know, that's not the kind of organizing I was doing. And to see like these encampments, to see the ways that young people are organizing in real time and also being politicized in real time is really inspiring. And I think that they are a generation that, you know, that may kind of take us over the hump to really get to a new place when we're talking about these liberation struggles. So that's what came to mind and kind of threw that out.
And Qui, I just want to throw this out. I mean, and that's true, but they have also been left with some profound embedded knowledges and history from Black struggle that they may not have not discovered until now. Right? And I think that's something to also note, because what we're seeing that's happening in terms of the kinds of protests, we know there's always been radical Black movements that go back, you know, during the civil rights movement, pre that, you know, the anti-colonial movements across, you know, the world, in Africa, in the Caribbean, in North America, right? I mean, going way back, I mean, there has always been struggle for liberation. There's always been people who were intent on freeing us. Okay? But as we move on, we see our world taken over in different ways, right? So while that is true, I do think they have also been left with certain kinds of resources that I'm seeing being applied today. Of course, there are different ways in which they are reinventing certain things, but clearly there's something there that we have left too, right? I just wanted to make that point.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes. And I say we because I feel like I'm one of the older people too. It's the only time I will say old or older. Okay. Who's next? Gary?
You're on mute, Gary.
It's the story of my life. I'll just say a few things because I really want to hear what other people have to say. I think this is a really exciting, very productive, transformative discussion. I think that we really have to recognize that, like, homonationalism, one of its fundamental problems is the nationalism and identification with white northern Western states built into it that we really need to destroy and figure out ways to concretely undermine that. And also all of the frameworks of the nation state, especially thought through the sort of northern Western capitalist state, really that we really need to move away from that in incredible ways, and also engage with, like, the need to radically challenge boundaries, notions of national citizenship, all of those sorts of stuff. And I think in some ways the Palestine solidarity movements that have emerged, which have been quite incredible in lots of ways, and I'm not saying they're perfect, there's lots of things that need to happen, and including the connections that need to be built between different forms of genocide that are going on right now, and support for the popular movements fighting in Haiti and so on. But I mean, they pose things in a more internationalist framework that really provide a way. And like, there's also organizations existing now that are beyond the framework of nation states, like the Palestine Youth Movement, which is actually organizing in numerous different locations. We need to begin to figure out, can we actually develop forms of organizing that might start initially just with discussions between activists and organizers in different places, but whether that can lead to a more radical, revolutionary, transformative, internationalist type of politics. I'll just leave it there. But I think that there's real openings for us now. But I think we also need to understand that they're trying to close this off quite actively by reasserting the Western Northern nation state, reasserting homonationalism, reasserting pinkwashing type practices, that there's lots of things we also have to fight against. So while there's opportunities and openings, there's also attempts to close and clamp all of those down.
Absolutely. Anyone? I mean, who would like to go next?
Folks have already spoken so eloquently to this. The only thing that I would add is I think, and this is something that I was very fortunate to be on a panel with Nisrin earlier this year as well, and I said it there as well. We think we really have to get away from this idea of scarcity of attention, of political mobilization, and to really mobilize around the very basic. It sounds so basic to say that none of us are free until all of us are free, and that our liberation has to be collective. It's a shared struggle, and to start from that vantage point. I think there is something happening where these internalizations of capitalist logic, of scarcity, of competition are coming into our movement. And I think there's a distinction between speaking about the way that anti-Blackness is mobilized to try to not highlight the genocides that are happening, or the corporate interests that are exploiting African nations and Caribbean nations. And at the same time, I think we need to say that it's right? We have to speak about all of these things. It's not a competition. It's that actually all of these struggles are connected. And if you care about one, you have to care about all of it. And that feels overwhelming for people. And I think that folks get scared of that, but it's not. Like, look at us all around the table today, speaking from all of our various vantage points. I only feel enriched. I don't feel depleted at the end of these conversations. I only feel like my analysis gets better. I only feel that I learn more, not just about quote unquote other struggles, which are not really other struggles, which are my struggle as well, but about, being Palestinian as well. And so I think it's really important to start these conversations from a place of and not from competition. And I say that recognizing that in this current moment, the Palestinian struggle is spoken about quite a bit in particular circles. So again, I only feel like nothing is taken away when we come together like this. Yeah, I think we all are enriched by it.
Absolutely. Nisrin, do you want to say something, please? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of pick up on what May was saying and say that part of what I've seen happening since October 7th is that the movement for a free Palestine, the solidarity movement in North America, has actually created an opening for people to want to know more about Sudan and the Congo and Haiti and so forth. And so
I agree.
Instead of it kind of, and I think it's often used, Zionists often use Sudan as a kind of whataboutist sort of, in a way.
Enclosure.
Exactly, to sort of distract from the genocide denial and so forth, without actually ever doing anything in solidarity with Sudanese people. And so I think, one, we have to pay attention to the way that our struggles get pitted against each other. And also sort of, and part of that, resisting against that, I think, has to do with us really drawing on the very long history of Black, Caribbean, North American, and also African solidarity with Palestine. Israel has always been a counter-revolutionary force, and they've always, since the 1960s, tried to, pit, essentially, like, get North African country to separate North Africa from so-called sub-Saharan Africa, in order to demobilize any form of solidarity with Palestine. And so for me, I think a lot about kind of Gulf empire making and the Emirates and its role in Sudan at the moment. They also have a quite negative role in Palestine, etc. And the ways that kind of empire making, right? That it actually would get challenged, right? That the free Palestine will change the relationship between Africa and the Middle East. It will change, it will empower our own liberation struggles, right? And so I think about the way that the Sudanese revolution, part of why the war is so brutal is because it's a counter-revolutionary war, because of the potential for that revolution to have spread across borders, right?
Exactly.
The vision of the Sudanese revolution to kind of reverberate throughout the region. We were, in fact, not latecomers to the Arab Spring. We started the Arab Spring and then ended it. And, there were many, many populations throughout Africa that never exist, right?
Exactly.
Because of their revolutionary potential to really kind of form this transnational network and of organizing. And the last thing I'll say is that if we think about the companies that are invested in Sudan and in weapons manufacturing companies weapons that are currently being used in Gaza and so forth, this network of corporate murderers, if you will, actually connect all of this for us already, right? And so part of what I always think about is taking the lead from our students in the encampments, right, is to really think about what it would look like to divest from all genocides, from the military-industrial complex, from the prison-industrial complex. In the end, a lot of the companies are the same. So I just wanted to,
Thank you, Nisrin. Thank you so much for that. Erica, did you want to say something? No? I want to I want to raise the issue, and it was talked about here, particularly by Qui and Gary, around criminalization and the police, and what we are witnessing now. And one of the things that I think, Gary, when you resigned from Pride, right? I did a response, and one of the things that I wanted to raise here, and what we are witnessing, is the escalation of policing and militarization, right? That we're witnessing, and we know that militarization is global, right? We know that based on everything that has been said here. In terms of the way that this global militarization is taking place. It's not just its extension of the West and to Israel, but its extension that has always been present in places like, Haiti, in the Sudan, in parts of Africa, where there's global militarized makeup and it's increased. It's escalated. Power has always been present in these spaces, and we have always been connected. That in the West have always been connected to this globalized, militarized policing power. And what we are witnessing now is something even much more lethal, as far as I'm concerned, because it comes also with no accountability, no discretion, no, what we are witnessing here is that that kind of level of violence can be unleashed on protesters at any time, pro-Palestinian protesters. It can be unleashed on protesters in encampment. We see what happened across the country. And we also know that kind of massive lethal violence is also not new, in the sense that it is not new to Black people in Canada, because often we like to say this only happens in the US. But we here in Canada have been dealing with police violence for decades, right? And it has been brutal. We had the 1992 uprising, which was brutal. During the apartheid era, they were brutal. They continue to be brutal at protests of Black people throughout the decades in this city. So a lot of the tactics that are being deployed are deployed based on what they have already tried on us, except now they have much more sophisticated technology and weaponry and other kinds of mechanism to which they deploy. But our bodies have been the recipient of that kind of violence. And I think one of the things that I think we also have to, in part of the struggle, and I want to hear from people, you know, in coalescing and intersecting and coming together as a liberation activist and in a liberation struggle, is that we have to talk about how violence is deployed very differently on different bodies. And yes, right now we are seeing pro-Palestinian protesters, including Jewish protesters who are supporting the Palestinian struggle, white people supporting the Palestinian struggle, and pro-Palestinians here in Canada who have not experienced that kind of policing, who have not experienced it here in North America, but it has been the experience of Black and Indigenous people for decades. And how we talk about that. So, you know, it will, how do we then, in organizing as queer and trans, as Black people, as African peoples, how do we in organizing take that into consideration in the struggle?
Can you hear me? I can say
Yes,
something on
Erica,
this.
I can hear you, Erica.
Awesome.
Yes, we can hear Erica, right? Yeah, great.
Yeah, so actually just on the 9th, the 9th was the second anniversary, I guess third anniversary of losing Corey Cardinal in Saskatoon. And Corey was a friend of mine. He was an advocate and brilliant writer and poet who consistently, while he was in prison in Saskatoon, fought for prisoners' rights and wrote poetry about the conditions that people are facing, Indigenous men, and particularly he was a big advocate for Indigenous women imprisoned in Saskatchewan. He always called them his sisters, and he would tell me, like, my sisters need this and my sisters are trying to organize around this. And the conditions in prisons in Saskatchewan, Canada, are despicable. And he was someone who really taught me that. And on the 9th in 2021, he passed away from an overdose. And that's part of the reason why I'm in Sapmi right now, is the level of violence that is occurring on the ground, that is being done to Indigenous people, even just in my neighborhood. And I'm so privileged that I could kind of get away from it for a while. But it's just like it strangles you. I would walk outside and move a block in the inner city in Saskatoon and before seeing a shrine put up for some ghost. Like maybe you could walk a block without running into a shrine that people had put up within the last few years. And like the underfunding of prairie harm reduction, they can't stay open. It's just like it is a war zone. And I was talking to a friend about that, and I said, is it insensitive at this moment to say this is a war zone? And he said, no, like that's the reality that so many of us are facing. And the constant presence of the police. And this goes back to May's point, and the one that Nisrin also followed up on. The struggle is universal, and I think that so many people see that, and have the capacity to hold all of these realities at once. I can't think of the overdose and poison toxic drug supply crisis, the lack of healthcare, without thinking of colonialism or anti-Blackness or police violence. To me, all of those, they just line up, right? Like you don't see the full picture until you're able to hold all of those complexities. And as Qui said, I know so many young people in my life who have no problem with that. And so again, I think as an organizer, it's just, and as a person trying to deal with all of the constant info into our heads and figure out how to be effective, it's realizing that we do have a critical mass all over the world. And so to not discount that.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah,
Anyone else would like?
Yeah, I think that was very well said.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that I'm finding that abolition can be an entry point for people to understand how these struggles are connected, right? Because I'm just like, and it's interesting because, around Pride, like people are like, the first Pride was a riot, right? But and yes, it was. And also, like, I think we have to really kind of think about why the police exist in North America particularly, and it is to control Black and Indigenous bodies, period. Like that's why they were literally created, right? And we have, in the US right now, there's these cop cities that are being popped up outside of major cities, right? Where these huge training grounds for militarized police to build their tactics, right? Militarized techniques that have been shared with the IDF, like literally NYPD officers going to Israel to be trained and vice versa, right? And so there's this quote that says kind of like fascism is basically like colonialism turned inwards, right? And I think that there's this way in which people have to understand that these tactics that are being deployed, militarized tactics in Palestine, all over the world globally, to suppress revolutionary movements, are also used in empire to squish liberation and solidarity with those places, right? And so I think it's always important for me, like, a couple years ago, it was still really hard to get people to think about what being an abolitionist was, right? And I think I lived in Minneapolis when George Floyd was murdered. And to see the ways in which people then started to say, like the police really ain't shit. And what is this abolition, right? Like literally, right? And saying, what is this and getting curious for the first time, like, what is this abolition thing y'all are talking about, right? To kind of as an entry point to kind of say, yeah, this violence that is being enacted on our communities, on Black communities, on Indigenous communities, is intentional and purposeful. And the more that we create these false narratives around safety, particularly for kind of like the thing to what you said, so like white gay men who have not experienced marginalization around their whiteness, but maybe around their queerness, are then kind of running to the police to think about, oh, well, you have to keep me safe as a queer person, right? Not thinking about the fact that Black trans people are being brutalized by the cops every day, right? And so I think that we're in a time where we can really use, and I've seen this with my own students, of entering the conversation of abolition and actually it opening up a lot more possibility to understand international solidarity struggles, right? And so I think keeping that focus is really important, to think about how violence is enacted for suppression in particular ways, because now we're seeing like cops in riot gear show up to things, right? We're not talking about like regular officers on the street. We're talking about SWAT gear. We're talking about bulletproof vests, machine guns. Like, that is a different level of militarization. And so we have to really understand that as long as we let those things happen domestically, they will continue to perpetuate empire internationally, and that is our way to understand struggle and build solidarity across that.
Thank you for that, Qui. Anybody else would like to add to this?
Maybe I'll just add one thing really quickly, this discussion's been fantastic and all of these connections are really crucial and important. I just also wanted to point out that I think another aspect of what's going on right now that I don't think we can go into a lot of detail on is a lot of people who used to be considered by some people anyway as our friends and allies. They're on the other side now. And I think that means coming to terms with politics is actually, and internationalist politics actually has to be done in a somewhat different way. Because like the people on the other side of us, like it's not just the mainstream white dominated LGBT and pride groups in the larger cities.
No.
Like the former Social Democrats and the New Democratic in numerous places, Olivia Chow. I mean, we could go on and on. Wab Kinew and the NDP government in Manitoba, the NDP government in BC. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which those forces are now on the other side against us. And that means that we have to actually have some different types of discussions about how we organize. That's all I wanted to sort of throw in. And obviously we can't really get into that here, but it's something that hopefully this type of dynamic of discussions and conversations can get us into at a later point. Thank you.
But I mean, the question becomes, is that depending on, where your focus has been in terms of the liberation struggle, you may not have seen these people ever with us. Like I personally have not seen those people on my side ever. I never saw these people as true liberationists. I never saw these people as wanting a different world. I've never seen these people as wanting a different society where actually capitalism wasn't the fundamental underpinning and colonialism was not the fundamental underpinning, nor imperialism. These people participated in all of that always at some point, because they also were parties that were very much the fabric of, its formation is built into these kinds of historical formations. So they were never with us. There were certain times when we could have counted on their support because they may have been impacted in certain ways by that, being queer, being, poor, they may have, there may be times when we felt that there could be some sort of connection, but I never invested in those people as people who really had a vested interest. So I'm actually not shocked or surprised by some of the stuff I'm seeing from people who people are surprised by. I'm actually relieved, actually, because now you know who you don't want as part of the struggle, because they're gonna break, I mean, this is my position. But this is not the people I want struggling with me, because I don't trust them. I don't feel they have a vested interests. But that's then my position. You know what I mean? I just wanted to Nisrin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say also, I think what I've noticed, I mean, this has been going on for a long time, but like the ways that Canada, the US, and European countries are using like African police forces or militaries, right, to then intervene, like the Kenyan police, being sent to intervene in Haiti, or for example, the British are now trying to kind of fund the Rwandan police state to receive deported African immigrants from the UK, right? So one of the first people to get deported in the scheme was a Sudanese refugee. Just the irony, right, of the British colonizer, in the middle of this brutal war that they historically at least have played a role in causing, are now deporting them to a Rwandan police state that is benefiting from the genocide in the Congo. And so also thinking about that, how you know, these countries, the sort of US empire, European countries are inflating our own police states that then get used against us as well, either to, you know, secure European and North American borders and so forth. So I think that's an important development to call out and to kind of watch.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nisrin. May, any last words? Because we're coming to the end. And Gary made a comment, which I think is important to acknowledge. He said he's not invested either, but it does alter the terrain of struggle. And we need to discuss and address doing organizing differently. Yes, I agree that we need to do organizing differently, absolutely. And the terrain has been shifted. You're right. You know, there's no question. Yeah. So I just wanted to add that. May, do you any last comments that you would like to make?
Very enthusiastic agreement with all that has said, and thank you to Qui also just making those links between what's happening with Cop City and those training exchanges that are happening between the IOF and police departments across the United States. I think it's a really important aspect, and what I really appreciate is that, just to go back to the previous conversation we were having, that this current moment is opening up all of those conversations. So these are things that activists have been speaking about for a long time. People have been making those connections, but now I see it. I log in to any kind of social media, and you see it. You see people speaking about it, and so yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our teaching. And I want to thank May, Gary Kinsman, Qui Alexander, Erica Violet Lee, Brianna Olson-Pitawanakwat, Nisrin Elamin. I want to thank our pro bono interpreters, Nathaniel and Lavender, for your amazing job and for being with us for the 2 hours. I want to thank Alessandra Jordan, who is our streamer. Without her, we will not be on live right now. So thank you, Alessandra. And I want to thank those who are following and have been following us. And I hope that you enjoy this as much as I did. I think this was a tremendous panel. It's one of my favorite panels, quite frankly, that we've had to date. I'm so appreciate that you all made it possible for us to be together today in this space together, and know that we continue the struggle, because we will never stop fighting for our lives. We will never stop fighting for the lives of Palestinian people, the lives of Black people, the lives of Indigenous people, the lives of Sudanese, Congolese, Haitian, and everywhere else in the world who are repressed, suppressed. We will continue to fight because we believe that we deserve livable lives as queer and trans people in this moment and onwards. Thank you, and happy birthday, Qui. And enjoy the rest of the evening. And again, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Happy birthday, Qui.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Beverly, and everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Beverly. Appreciate it.
Okay, the stream's